in the shadows of Rome's grand monuments and beneath the weight of its political machinations, there lived a woman whose life was intertwined with the fate of the Republic. Cornelia Cinna, daughter of a distinguished family, would find herself at the center of power, a symbol of the intertwining of love, loyalty, and ambition in one of history's most tumultuous eras. Her story was not one of emperors or generals, but of a woman who would stand beside Julius Caesar, a man destined to change the course of history as the political landscape of Rome shifted beneath her feet. Cornelia's life would be marked by moments of personal sacrifice, immense loss, and quiet resilience. The struggle for power between the ruling families was fierce, and as the daughter of a prominent Roman, Cornelia would learn early that in Rome, even the most intimate bonds were subject to the whims of fate and fortune. Her legacy would not be one of glory alone, but of the quiet, enduring strength that accompanied the trials of being a woman in the heart of a republic on the brink of collapse. Cornelia Cinna was born into a time of great uncertainty. The year was 100 BCE, and Rome was teetering on the brink of both political reform and civil unrest. Her father, Lucius Cornelius Cinna, was a prominent Roman politician, a man with influence and ambition. He had long been associated with the populares, a political faction that sought to advance the interests of the common people against the traditional optimates. The ruling aristocracy, Lucius had been a staunch ally of Gaius Marius, one of Rome's most powerful generals, and their alliance had brought Cinna into the folds of Roman politics at an early age. But Cornelia's childhood, while marked by the privilege of her family's position, was far from ordinary. As a child of the elite, she was expected to learn the ways of Roman society, the intricacies of politics, the art of diplomacy, and the role of women in a patriarchal system. Though young, Cornelia would often sit at the feet of her father, listening intently as he discussed matters of great importance with his friends and allies. Yet, in the back of her mind, she knew that her life was destined for something greater than just the role of wife or mother. She saw how her father's ambition, his alliances, and his actions could shape the world around him. She could not help but wonder if she too might one day play a part in the political drama that would unfold in Rome. Her mother, a woman of quiet grace, often reminded her of the delicate balance between duty and emotion. Cornelia admired her mother's strength, even as she felt the weight of the world press upon her young shoulders. The events of her early life would shape her into a woman who would stand by the side of one of the most ambitious men in Rome, Julius Caesar. Cornelia's world was one of constant political turmoil. Rome, once a republic ruled by laws, was slowly descending into a brutal contest of power. In 87 BCE, as Cornelia was still a young girl, her father was killed in the political turmoil surrounding the conflict between Marius and the general Sulla. Marius's death had led to the rise of Sulla, who, seeking revenge against his enemies, had conducted a series of bloody proscriptions. Cornelia's father had fallen victim to this purge, leaving her and her family to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics without the guiding hand of a patriarch. As a result, Cornelia's world was forever changed. No longer would she be able to live in the safety of the traditional Roman aristocracy. Her family's political fall from grace forced her to face the brutality of Roman power struggles firsthand. She was thrust into a world where loyalty was bought with blood, and alliances were as fragile as the fortunes they were built upon. It was in the midst of this chaos that Cornelia would meet Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, the rising star of Rome, was a man of ambition and intellect. He was a cousin of Cornelia's, a connection through his mother's side, and it was this familial tie that first brought him into her orbit. But while Cornelia was the daughter of a fallen political figure, Caesar was a man on the rise, determined to restore the fortunes of his family and carve out a place for himself in the annals of Roman history. Their engagement was not a love story in the traditional sense. It was a marriage forged out of necessity, as much as it was born from affection. Cornelia, whose family had been upended by political upheaval, needed a man of influence and power to help restore her family's status. Julius Caesar, who was also navigating the treacherous political landscape, saw in Cornelia a woman of quiet strength, a daughter of a man who had fought for the common people, someone whose family lineage might help him in his own rise to power. Despite the political motives behind their union, there was a mutual respect between the two. Cornelia admired Caesar's sharp intellect, his tenacity, and his ability to navigate the complex world of Roman politics. For Caesar, Cornelia represented both a link to the past and a symbol of his future. She was a woman who understood the political game, and she would prove to be a valuable ally, even as their marriage unfolded against the backdrop of a Rome in crisis. Their marriage marked the beginning of a tumultuous chapter in both of their lives. And for Cornelia, it would be a life defined not just by her relationship with Caesar, but by the larger forces at play in the Roman Republic. As she navigated the challenges of being married to a man whose ambitions were boundless, she would also find herself becoming a figure of strength in her own right, someone who could endure the trials and tragedies that would come to define her life. As Cornelia grew older, the weight of her family's name and the shifting tides of Roman politics shaped her fate in ways she could not yet fully understand. The once proud Cornelia family, though still influential, had lost much of their former glory. The loss of her father, Lucius Cornelius Cinna, was a devastating blow, not just personally but politically. Cornelia, now a young woman, found herself navigating the treacherous currents of Rome's political landscape without the protection of her father's power. Yet, even in the face of such challenges, Cornelia's beauty, intelligence, and noble birth did not go unnoticed. She was courted by many suitors, all seeking to align themselves with the Cornelia name, hoping to gain some advantage in the ever-shifting game of Roman politics. However, Cornelia's heart remained steadfastly focused on one man, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, the ambitious young man from the Julii family, had long been a rising star in Roman politics. His lineage was one of nobility, but it had fallen from prominence in recent years. Caesar, however, was not one to accept a life of mediocrity. He had already made a name for himself as a brilliant military strategist and orator, and his charisma and ambition had begun to earn him the favor of the populace, the political faction that sought reform in favor of the plebeians. Caesar's meteoric rise to power had placed him at odds with the Optimates, the conservative faction that held the reins of the Roman Senate. His alliances with influential figures like Pompey the Great and Crassus, both of whom shared his disdain for the existing political system, would soon shape the future of Rome itself. Cornelia and Julius Caesar's first meeting had been arranged by mutual friends, but there was an instant recognition between them. It was not love at first sight, but there was an undeniable connection that would grow over time. Cornelia, who had spent years watching the political struggles of Rome unfold, understood the importance of alliances. She knew that marriage was often a political maneuver, an instrument of power more than a union of hearts. Yet, in Caesar, she saw something more, a man driven not just by personal ambition, but by a vision for Rome's future. In 84 BCE, when Cornelia was around 16 years old, she was married to Julius Caesar. It was a union that would cement both their fates in the grand story of Roman history. At the time, Caesar was just beginning his rise, and the political winds were shifting. Sulla, the once powerful general who had defeated Marius and seized control of Rome, had begun his march back into the city. It was a turbulent period for Rome, and Cornelia's marriage to Caesar was both a personal and political move. Caesar needed to secure his future, and Cornelia, with her prestigious family name and connections, could offer him a foothold in the Senate. The match was one of convenience, but over time, it became something more. The marriage itself was not without challenges. Caesar's early political career was marked by tension with the ruling Optimates, particularly Sulla's supporters. When Caesar was called to serve in Asia Minor as part of a diplomatic mission, Cornelia was left behind in Rome, vulnerable to the whims of Sulla and his allies. At the time, Sulla, who had now consolidated his power, was purging his enemies from Rome's political elite. When Caesar refused to divorce Cornelia, as Sulla demanded, the general's wrath was swift. Sulla stripped Caesar of his inheritance and status, leaving him with few allies in Rome. It was during this period of political isolation that Cornelia showed her true character. She stood by her husband, offering him unwavering support despite the hardships they faced. The pressures of their marriage, political, social, and personal, became a crucible that tested their bond. Cornelia, once a sheltered young woman, now found herself immersed in the complex world of Roman politics. As she watched her husband navigate the treacherous path between loyalty, ambition, and survival, while Caesar was away in Asia, Cornelia managed their affairs in Rome, keeping the family's name intact and ensuring that Caesar's political future was not lost. Her efforts did not go unnoticed. As Caesar made his way back to Rome, having served with distinction in Asia, he began to rebuild his reputation. Cornelia, now a seasoned political wife, was at the heart of these efforts. Though the challenges of their marriage were many, Cornelia's loyalty to Caesar, combined with her own political acumen, helped to solidify their bond. In 78 BCE, the death of Sulla allowed for a temporary restoration of power to the populace faction. Caesar seized this opportunity, aligning himself with Pompey and Crassus to form the First Triumvirate, a political alliance that would effectively dominate Roman politics for the next decade. During this time, Cornelia played a quiet yet crucial role behind the scenes, using her position to help cement Caesar's growing power and to ensure that their children were well taken care of. However, despite the political successes, the personal side of their marriage was often marked by distance. Caesar's ambition meant that he was frequently away on military campaigns or engaging in political maneuvering, leaving Cornelia to manage their household and maintain their family's position in Roman society. The birth of their daughter, Julia, in 76 BCE, was a brief moment of joy, but even this was tinged with the awareness that political ambition often came at a personal cost. Cornelia's role in this union was not as a passive bystander, but as a partner who understood the stakes. As Caesar's political fortunes rose, Cornelia, ever the pragmatic Roman woman, found herself not just the wife of an ambitious politician, but a woman deeply embedded in the intricacies of Rome's shifting political landscape. She had long since come to understand the cost of power and the price of standing by a man like Caesar. By the time Julius Caesar returned to Rome in 78 BC, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. The reign of Sulla, which had sought to restore the power of the Senate and the aristocracy, was over. Sulla's death had left Rome in a state of fragile peace. But the cracks in the Roman Republic were growing ever wider. The internal strife that had plagued Rome for years, factionalism, power struggles, and civil unrest showed no sign of abating. The political system that had once been the envy of the world now seemed to be crumbling under the weight of corruption, ambition, and violence. Caesar, having endured the purges of Sulla and the political fallout of his refusal to divorce Cornelia, had returned to Rome with a burning desire to reclaim his family's honor and build his own power. But the path ahead would not be easy. Though he was a member of the patrician class, he had been stripped of much of his inherited wealth and influence. His future depended not just on his personal abilities, but on his capacity to navigate the shifting alliances within Roman society. Cornelia, ever the supportive wife, was a silent partner in his ambition, while Julius Caesar maneuvered through the complexities of Roman politics, building alliances with men like Pompey the Great and Crassus. Cornelia's role was more subtle but equally crucial. She managed their household, ensured that their family's reputation remained intact, and, most importantly, supported Caesar in the quiet moments when the weight of political life threatened to overwhelm him. Their marriage, once primarily a political arrangement, had evolved into a partnership rooted in mutual respect and loyalty. But this partnership was not without its challenges. While Caesar's public career flourished, Cornelia's private life was often fraught with uncertainty and fear. The political landscape of Rome was increasingly dangerous, and even Caesar's allies were not immune to the tides of power. With the rise of the first triumvirate Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, Cornelia watched her husband engage in a series of political games that would ultimately change the course of Roman history. The stakes were higher than ever before, and every move they made had the potential to be their last. One of the key struggles in this period was the growing tension between Caesar and the ruling Optimates, the conservative faction in the Senate that sought to maintain the status quo. Though Caesar was initially a supporter of populist reforms, his rapid rise in power made him a target for the old guard. As his political ambitions grew, so did the animosity between him and the Senate. The Optimates saw him as a threat to the traditional Roman system, and their resentment only deepened as Caesar gained popularity among the plebeians. For Cornelia, the consequences of her husband's political actions were not merely theoretical. As Caesar's political rivals mounted their opposition, Cornelia found herself in the crossfire. There were whispers in Rome's salons and among the elite that she, too, would suffer the consequences of her husband's defiance. The life she had once known, one of privilege and respect, was now filled with uncertainty. The fragility of Roman political life, where loyalty could be betrayed at any moment, weighed heavily on her. As Julius Caesar continued to climb the political ladder, his ambition led him to seek greater military power. In 60 BCE, Caesar secured the consulship, a major political achievement, but it was his subsequent actions that would begin to define his legacy. With his political and military career now in full swing, Caesar's military campaigns in Gaul were not just a way to assert his dominance over the Roman world. They were also a means to secure his political future. Caesar knew that military success was the key to true power in Rome, and he pursued it relentlessly. During this time, Cornelia's role as the wife of a rising political star became increasingly complicated. Though she had always understood the demands of Roman politics, the growing tensions between her husband and the Senate made her more acutely aware of the dangers of his ambition. There were times when she would hear of conspiracies against Caesar, and her heart would sink at the thought of what might happen to him or to their family if the political tides turned against them. It was in the midst of this uncertainty that tragedy struck. In 54 BCE, Cornelia's beloved daughter, Julia, Caesar's only child with her, died in childbirth. Julia's death was a devastating blow to Cornelia. Not only had she lost her daughter, but Caesar had lost his closest political ally. Julia's marriage to Pompey the Great had solidified the political alliance between Caesar and Pompey, and her death severed the fragile bond between the two men. The political consequences of this loss would reverberate throughout Rome, and Cornelia, already burdened by the uncertainties of her husband's political battles, was forced to confront the reality that their family's future might be at risk. In the wake of Julia's death, Caesar's relationship with Pompey began to deteriorate. The fragile alliance that had once held the triumvirate together was now crumbling. For Cornelia, the shifting tides of Roman politics were becoming more dangerous by the day. As her husband prepared for his campaigns in Gaul, she could do little but watch from the sidelines, her own fears and concerns eclipsed by the broader forces of history. Though Cornelia's role in her husband's political life was largely behind the scenes, her influence was undeniable. She was the silent force that held their family together during the darkest times. She kept the household in order, offered her husband the emotional support he needed, and remained a steadfast partner in a marriage that was constantly tested by the forces of ambition, loyalty, and love. As Julius Caesar set his sights on further conquests, and the political climate in Rome grew increasingly hostile, Cornelia knew that the future of their family, and perhaps the Republic itself, hung in the balance. She was a woman caught between the demands of power and the fragility of life in the Roman world. And as her husband's ambitions carried him further from Rome, Cornelia would be left to grapple with the harsh realities of a life lived in the shadows of power. By the time Julius Caesar's political career reached a fever pitch in the 50s BCE, Cornelia's life had irrevocably shifted from the quiet existence she had once envisioned. The world around her was transforming into something unrecognizable, and yet she found herself inextricably bound to Caesar's ambitions, which now spanned the breadth of the Roman world. The echoes of power, betrayal, and war were everywhere through the walls of their house in Rome, into the great halls of the Senate, and far beyond the city's borders into the lands Caesar was conquering. It had been years since Julius Caesar's initial ascent in Roman politics, and the political stage was more chaotic than ever. His early campaigns in Gaul, which had been touted as a display of Roman military supremacy, were increasingly becoming the foundation of his growing influence. In the eyes of the Senate, Caesar was no longer just a rising star, he was a threat. His military success was laying the groundwork for something larger, something that had the potential to bring the entire Roman Republic to its knees. The Senate, in its traditional role as the ultimate arbiter of power, could not allow a man who had so greatly surpassed them to continue unchecked. For Cornelia, these were dangerous times. Her husband's rise was accompanied by both grandeur and peril. The Senate was growing ever more hostile toward him, especially after the formation of the First Triumvirate, a political alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. While this alliance initially provided a buffer against the Senate's disapproval, it also tied Caesar's fate to that of two other powerful men, Pompey, whose ambitions were as vast as Caesar's, and Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. Though their partnership promised to secure Caesar's power, it also came with its own set of tensions and risks. As Caesar's influence continued to grow, so did the pressure on his personal life. Cornelia, once a quiet observer of the political landscape, was now thrust into the heart of the tumultuous world her husband had created. The increasing isolation from the Senate, the rising animosity from Pompey after Crassus's death, and the looming threat of civil war forced her to grapple with the reality of their situation. She had always known that politics and power could be dangerous, but now she understood that the very foundation of the Republic could be crumbling under their feet. The tension reached a breaking point in 49 BCE when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the river that marked the boundary between his province of Gaul and Italy. His decision to march on Rome was an irrevocable step, one that sealed the fate of the Roman Republic and thrust Caesar into open conflict with Pompey and the Senate. "The die is cast," Caesar famously declared, crossing the Rubicon and taking the first steps toward civil war. Cornelia, as always, stood by her husband, though this time, the stakes were higher than ever. In the weeks and months that followed Caesar's declaration of war, she watched from afar, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the peace of their home, their family, and even Rome itself was slipping away. The Senate, once the voice of Roman authority, now stood divided between those loyal to Pompey and those who, like Caesar, sought a new order. The clash of armies, of political ideals, would soon follow, though Cornelia did not have a direct hand in the military campaigns. She played a crucial role in ensuring that Caesar's legacy would remain intact in Rome. Even as he marched to war, there were whispers in the Senate about her influence, about her strength in moments of crisis. She worked behind the scenes, meeting with Caesar's supporters, reinforcing the loyalty of the people closest to them. In a way, Cornelia became the linchpin of Caesar's political survival in Rome. Her intelligence, political acumen, and quiet strength were just as important as any military victory Caesar could claim on the battlefield. The civil war that followed was brutal, and the consequences of Caesar's decision to march on Rome would echo throughout the centuries. Cornelia, who had long been the quiet observer, now understood that the balance of power in Rome was shifting in ways no one could predict. Caesar's eventual victory over Pompey, and the subsequent return to Rome as the undisputed ruler, marked the final collapse of the Republic and the beginning of a new era. Yet even in the aftermath of Caesar's victory, Cornelia's life remained fraught with complexity. She had seen her husband ascend to heights no one in Rome had ever thought possible. But she also knew the cost of such power. Caesar's relationship with the Senate was now irreparably damaged, and the loyalty of the Roman people, though immense, was fragile. He was, after all, a man who had taken Rome by force. The following years were a period of unprecedented power for Julius Caesar. In 46 BCE, he was named dictator for life, a title that effectively made him the ruler of Rome in all but name. Cornelia, by this point, had come to terms with the magnitude of her husband's position. The life of a Roman wife, particularly one married to a man of such towering ambition, was often one of sacrifice, and Cornelia was no exception. She had sacrificed her privacy, her comfort, and her safety in order to support Caesar's rise. In private moments, when they were together away from the political whirlwind, Cornelia would often reflect on the journey that had brought them here. The young woman who had once been thrust into a marriage of convenience had become a key figure in the rise of one of history's most influential leaders. Their marriage, born of political necessity, had transformed into something more, an intricate partnership of power, loyalty, and love. But the political landscape was never static, and even in the face of immense success, danger was always lurking. While Caesar had secured his power, there were always those who sought to undermine him, jealous of his success and fearful of his intentions. Even Cornelia, ever the loyal wife, knew that the price of Caesar's ambition might one day be his life. As Caesar's power reached its zenith, Rome became increasingly unstable. The Senate, increasingly disillusioned with Caesar's absolute power, plotted against him. The whispers of conspiracy grew louder, and soon, the unthinkable happened. In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators, including some of his closest allies, including Brutus and Cassius. The dagger that killed Caesar struck not just a man but the very heart of the Roman Republic. For Cornelia, the news of Caesar's assassination was not just the end of an era. It was the loss of the man she had loved, the man who had risen from the ashes of a broken republic to become the supreme ruler of Rome. The political world that Caesar had fought so hard to reshape was now in chaos once again. Cornelia, in her grief, found herself in a new role, that of a widow, a political figure in her own right, and yet, perhaps for the first time, completely uncertain of what the future held. The world Cornelia had once known, one of Roman aristocracy, political intrigue, and ambition, had been irrevocably changed by the outbreak of civil war. Julius Caesar's decision to march on Rome had begun a chain of events that would fracture the very foundation of the Roman Republic. The Senate, now divided, had declared Caesar a traitor, and Pompey, once his ally, had joined forces with the Senate in an attempt to preserve the old order. Civil war was now inevitable. The path forward was marked by the clang of weapons, the cry of soldiers, and the ever-looming shadow of political betrayal. For Cornelia, the personal stakes of the war could not have been higher. Her husband, whom she had married out of political necessity and later came to love, was now the commander of one of the largest and most powerful military campaigns in Roman history. As Caesar led his legions into battle against Pompey's forces, the course of the war, along with her own future, hung in the balance. In Rome, Cornelia had remained behind, surrounded by political factions that now saw her husband as both a threat and a symbol of the Republic's instability. The Senate, led by the remnants of Pompey's supporters, had made it clear that they saw Julius Caesar as a usurper who sought to dismantle the foundations of Roman governance. And though Caesar's enemies tried to discredit him, Cornelia stood as his unwavering supporter, working to maintain ties with his allies and, most importantly, with the people who would decide the outcome of the war. While Caesar's forces clashed with Pompey's army across Italy, Cornelia became a figure of quiet resilience. She oversaw the correspondence between Caesar's allies in Rome, ensuring that his policies and victories were presented in the best possible light. In the back rooms of the Senate, where political games were played and power was exchanged like coins, Cornelia's influence became more significant. Senators loyal to Caesar began to lean on her for advice, understanding that her wisdom and understanding of Roman politics could steer them through the perilous waters of wartime diplomacy. But while her political savvy was critical, the personal toll of the war weighed heavily on Cornelia. The letters she received from Caesar were fewer and fewer. As his military campaign intensified, Caesar, who had once been so devoted to her, was now consumed with the demands of war. As the conflict with Pompey dragged on, Cornelia's mind often wandered to her husband's safety. Would he return to her, or would she be left to bear the burden of his ambition alone? In the year 48 BCE, the decisive Battle of Pharsalus would take place, marking the turning point of the war. Pompey's forces, though numerous, were ultimately outmaneuvered by Caesar's seasoned legions. Pompey himself, a figure once so powerful in Rome, fled to Egypt in search of refuge. But his hopes for safety were dashed when he was assassinated upon arrival. His death a stark reminder of the brutal consequences of political ambition. The war, which had torn the Republic apart, was essentially over. Caesar had won. When the news of Pompey's death reached Rome, it was both a moment of triumph and a somber realization for Cornelia. Her husband's victory was complete, and yet she knew that the political landscape had shifted beyond recognition. The Republic was no more, and Caesar's rise to power had set in motion the transformation of Rome into a new kind of empire. The Senate, weakened and divided, could no longer stand in his way. For Cornelia, the victory was bittersweet. She had supported her husband through the darkest hours of the war, but she knew that Caesar's ultimate victory meant the end of the republic she had once known. The days of political alliances and power struggles within the Senate were now replaced by the rule of one man. As Caesar returned to Rome in triumph, with his army at his back and the Senate in disarray, Cornelia faced the reality of a world where her husband's power would no longer be challenged. Her role as Caesar's wife, once centered around political alliance and loyalty, now became one of strategic support as he consolidated his power. Julius Caesar was not only the most powerful man in Rome, he was now the figurehead of a new era, one that would mark the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. In the wake of Caesar's victory, Cornelia's life seemed to fall into a new rhythm. She was no longer the young wife of an ambitious man struggling to prove himself. She was the wife of the most powerful figure in the Western world, a woman who had navigated the complexities of Roman politics, war, and betrayal with dignity and strength. Yet, the happiness she had once imagined for herself seemed distant. Caesar's increasing focus on his political reforms, the expansion of his power, and his eventual declaration as Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, led to further tensions in their marriage. Cornelia understood the weight of Caesar's position, and while she never questioned his authority, she often felt isolated from the man she had once loved so deeply. Caesar, consumed by his ambitions, was no longer the husband who had once shared his hopes and dreams with her. The demands of ruling Rome, of shaping its future, left little room for the kind of partnership they had once shared. Yet, it was in this final period of their relationship that Cornelia found herself facing the most devastating loss. In 44 BCE, just a few years after Caesar's rise to absolute power, tragedy struck. Cornelia's beloved husband was assassinated on the Ides of March. His death, orchestrated by a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius, sent shockwaves through Rome. The man who had conquered the Republic and reshaped the course of history was gone, and with him, a new era of Roman power died as well. For Cornelia, the loss was not just the death of her husband, it was the end of an era. Caesar had been her partner in every sense, even though their lives had been torn apart by the machinations of Rome's power-hungry elite. Now, with his death, Cornelia found herself caught between grief and the harsh realities of Roman politics. The Republic was gone, and Caesar's death marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which his adopted heir, Octavian, later known as Augustus, would rise to power and establish the Roman Empire. Cornelia's life, once defined by the ambitious hopes of a young bride, had been shaped by political machinations, wars, and betrayals. Now, she stood as a widow in a Rome that had been irrevocably changed by her husband's vision. She had given everything for him, her loyalty, her love, her political acumen, but in the end, it was all for naught. Caesar was gone, and the world she had once known would never be the same again. The years following Julius Caesar's conquest of Rome marked a profound transformation in the life of Cornelia Cinna. As her husband's power grew, so too did the complexities of their relationship and her position within the shifting landscape of Roman politics. With Caesar firmly entrenched as the dictator of Rome, the republic that Cornelia had known, a system built on shared power, Senate debate, and the rights of the citizens, was fading into the shadows of history. What lay ahead was a world where absolute power, held by one man, would change the course of Rome and, ultimately, the world. In 46 BCE, Caesar returned to Rome after his victorious campaigns. Hailed as the conqueror of Gaul and the architect of the Roman Empire's dominance over the known world, his triumphs were celebrated with lavish parades and public spectacles. In many ways, Caesar's return was a testament to the fruits of his ambition and military genius. But for Cornelia, it was also a time of personal reflection. She had stood by Caesar's side through the early years of his rise, through the personal sacrifices and political battles. But now, as the center of power shifted to Caesar's hands, Cornelia found herself struggling to reconcile the man she had once known with the ruler he had become. The political landscape of Rome was irreversibly changed. The Senate, which had once been the ultimate authority in the Republic, had been rendered largely impotent in the wake of Caesar's rise. Caesar's reforms were sweeping. He restructured the government, reformed the calendar, and distributed land to veterans. His vision for Rome was one of centralization and power consolidation. In many ways, he was a visionary, seeking to stabilize the Republic after decades of internal conflict. Yet, in doing so, he had dissolved the foundations of the Senate's power and had become a figurehead of autocracy, which many feared would lead to tyranny. Cornelia, like many others, watched from the sidelines. Despite her own important role in supporting Caesar's early years, the personal toll of his ambition began to weigh on her. The political turbulence of the past decade had forced her into a quieter, more passive role. Once an active participant in Caesar's political and social maneuverings, she now found herself relegated to the background. But the tides of fate were never kind to the women who lived in the shadows of Roman power. As the months passed, Cornelia came to understand that the greatness of her husband would not last forever. The Senate, humiliated by Caesar's dictatorial rule, plotted against him in secret. The conspirators, led by Brutus, Cassius, and a group of senators disillusioned by Caesar's increasing authority, saw the only way forward as the assassination of the man who had effectively become Rome's sole ruler. The date was March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March. It was a day that would live in infamy. When the news of Julius Caesar's assassination reached Cornelia, it was as though the ground beneath her had shifted. Her heart broke, not just for the man she had loved, but for the world that had died with him. The dream of Rome that she had shared with Caesar, of a reformed republic, of a stronger, more united empire, lay shattered in the wake of his death. For Cornelia, the murder of her husband marked the end of an era. The man she had supported through thick and thin was no longer there to protect her, and the political winds of Rome, ever unpredictable, now blew with the scent of uncertainty. Despite the grief that consumed her, Cornelia understood that Rome would continue. The Republic, though deeply wounded by Caesar's assassination, would stagger on for a time. But for Cornelia, her story had reached its conclusion. The world she had known was no more. and the place she had occupied beside one of Rome's most famous figures could no longer be sustained. In the years following Caesar's death, Cornelia withdrew from public life. She had borne witness to the rise and fall of the greatest leader Rome had ever known, and the costs of such a life were immense. Though Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, would eventually rise to power, Cornelia's days of involvement in Rome's political drama were over. She sought solace in her private life, far removed from the intrigues of the Senate and the military campaigns that had so often dictated the lives of those around her. Her children, if she had any, would carry on her legacy, but she would remain a woman who had once been at the heart of history. Cornelia Cinna's final years were quiet ones, spent reflecting on a life lived in the shadow of power. She was a woman who had witnessed the rise and fall of the Roman Republic, the death of its ideals, and the birth of a new order. Though her name would not be remembered with the same grandeur as that of her husband, Julius Caesar, Cornelia's role in his life was vital. She was a witness to history, a symbol of loyalty and sacrifice, and a reminder that the lives of those closest to power are often the most overlooked, yet the most important. In the end, Cornelia Cinna's life was not one of vast political victories or military conquests. It was the life of a woman who lived beside a man whose vision of Rome changed the world. Her legacy, like that of many women of her time, is one written not in the annals of military campaigns or Senate records, but in the quiet moments of support, strength, and perseverance. Her story, though often overshadowed by the deeds of Julius Caesar, remains a poignant reminder of the cost of ambition and the resilience of those who stand beside history's greatest figures. Cornelia Cinna's life, as we see it in the context of Roman history, is the story of a woman who lived at the intersection of power and personal sacrifice. She was more than just the wife of Julius Caesar. She was a silent partner in his rise, a political strategist in her own right, and a witness to the turbulent transformation of the Roman world. Through her eyes, we gain insight into the complexities of Roman politics, the intimate dynamics of a powerful marriage, and the price of greatness, the loss of Julius Caesar, both as a political leader and as a husband, left Cornelia to grapple with the legacy of a man whose actions reshaped the course of history. Yet, in her quiet reflection, we find that history is not only made by those who wield the sword but also by those who endure and support the weight of power.